Kalimera y kalispera. Wherever you're zooming in from, and do take a moment to tell us where you are, welcome to the first lecture of the 2021 Archaeology Lecture Series, co-sponsored by the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture, the Coates Institute of Archaeology at UCLA, and the Archaeological Institute of America, Los Angeles County Society. I'm John Papadopoulos, professor in the Department of Classics and the Coates Institute of Archaeology here at UCLA, and I'm pleased to be your host this morning, afternoon, or early evening, depending on where you are. Today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome an old friend and someone who is no stranger to the West Coast of the United States, Dr. Anastassios Antonaras, better known as Tasso. I got to know Tasso well in 2019 when he was in LA as a Getty Scholar for an academic quarter, together with his wife, the artist Manya Evstathio. Tasso, as you will see, is a specialist on the history of glass, jewelry, textiles, and as you will see, he will weave into today's lecture several of these specialities. He completed his BA in archaeology at the University of Belgrade, an MA in museum studies at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and his PhD in archaeology at the University of Yanina. He comes to us as the head of the Department of Exhibitions, Education, and Communication of the Museum of Byzantine Culture in Thessaloniki, one of the great museums of Europe. Now, if you haven't visited the Byzantine Museum, next time you're in Greece, please do yourselves a favor. He's the author of numerous books, including Glassworking, Ancient and Medieval, 2008, Roman and Early Christian Glass working vessels from Thessaloniki and its region, which actually got a prize in 2010 from the Academy of Athens, Fire and Sand, 2012, Artisanal Production in Ancient and Byzantine Thessaloniki, 2019, Glassware and Glassworking in Thessaloniki, 2017, and The Art of Glass, works from the collection of the Museum of Byzantine Culture in 2019. He's also working on the glass from the Corinth excavations of the American School of Classical Studies. And we're actually looking forward to welcoming him back to Los Angeles, fingers crossed, in person sometime in 2022, at which time he will work on his next big project, the publication of the rich and diverse ancient and Islamic glass collection of the J. Paul Getty Museum in Malibu. The great thing about Tasso is that he's not just a glass or jewelry or textiles nerd, but a scholar who has that rare ability to bring to life from the small bits and pieces, to bring to life people from the small bits and pieces they left behind. His talk today is entitled Documenting Diversity in Thessaloniki and its Hinterland. It was originally 3 archaeological stories. It's now been changed to 4 archaeological stories. So please join me in welcoming Anastassios Antonaras.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon. I would like first to thank the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture for the kind invitation to present my research, and Professor John Papadopoulos for moderating the discussion. Today, I would like to trace the presence of others in late Roman and Byzantine Thessaloniki and its environs through a series of jewels and a clay vessel. I have selected 4 case studies. A girl with African religious beliefs who lived in the last quarter of the 3rd century, a Slav woman of the late 8th century, an 11th century Jew, and a group of archers using reflex bows of the 14th, 15th centuries. Let me begin the talk with a short overview of Thessaloniki's long and complex history. Thessaloniki Thessaloniki was founded by Cassander, later king of Macedon, in 316-315 BCE, by joining 26 smaller settlements in a strategic position in the Thermaic Gulf. It was the most important center on the Via Egnatia, connecting the trade routes running through the valleys of Moravia and Anastassios, with the Nubian area and the Balkan hinterlands with the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean. The strategic position of the city played a decisive role in its future development. The city experienced a period of steady and constant growth in both its political and economic importance from the Roman conquest in 168 BCE until 298-99 CE, when it was chosen by Galerius as his capital and the temporary residence of Constantine I and Theodosius I in the following century. During the early Byzantine period, Thessaloniki remained one of the largest cities in the Eastern Mediterranean with around 100,000 inhabitants, according to some historians. Groups of foreign trades, Romans, Jews, and other Levantines were active in Thessaloniki, extending their activities into the city's hinterland from the late Hellenistic period and during the Roman imperial times. The Roman Agora and the imperial palatial complex with the rotunda, the triumphal arch of Galerius, and the hippodrome dominate even today the cityscape of Thessaloniki. From very early on, Thessaloniki was delineated by its walls. The city was laid out on a rectangular grid, which is still visible in the modern city. Main roads are still visible today, such as the Decumanus Maximus, known as the Via Regia, which is modern-day Egnatia Street, stretching on an east-west axis and its parallels to the Decumani, as well as several vertical to them streets, the so-called cardines. These marble-paved streets, or at least the more important among them, had covered pavements, portico stoas, and modern Venizelos Street stands out among the several preserved ancient cardines lined with these column-supported porticos. At its junction with the Via Regia, there stood a monumental tetrapylon, which remained in use even after the end of antiquity into the Dark Ages, and probably up until the 9th century. This extremely important complex, witness to the city's public life, was uncovered during the excavations for the new metro line and is the core of a long-lasting friction among the local society and the specialists on the one side, favoring its preservation on site as part of the new metro station, and the state on the other side, which has ordered the removal of the street and nearby ancient buildings from their original position, and the eventual repositioning of part of them after the excavation's conclusion. A decision that we archaeologists feel violates the laws and ethical rules we apply and our constitution demands. I will continue with the merrier aspects of life, focusing on the cemeteries. On both flat and accessible sides of the city, east and west, clusters of groupings of tombs stretched for miles, forming huge graveyards. Several funeral basilicas and martyria were found on the sites of both necropolises due to the Christian preference to be buried near sites sanctified by martyrdom or the grave of a martyr. We will focus tonight on a single grave that was not connected to the Christian faith and preserved some indications of the exotic, non-local beliefs and or the origin of its owner. This young person, who preserved features of some social otherness that we will present, has been identified among the burials excavated at the plot of the Museum of Byzantine Culture, which you see on the screen now. The finds are exhibited in museum's permanent exhibition in the gallery titled From the Elysian Fields to the Christian Paradise. This display is dedicated to ideas held by Thessalonians from the 2nd to the 7th century regarding death and funeral rites, continuities and discontinuities in the way pagans and Christians perceived afterlife are touched upon. The typology of tombs results of the social and economic status of their occupants is presented as one seen in the cemeteries outside the city walls. as the miasma of death had to remain away from the world of the living. Furthermore, funerary inscriptions and objects that accompanied the deceased in tombs and others used for the worship of the dead are exhibited. The display is completed with a series of extremely rare funerary paintings that illustrate in an exceptional way the transition from the late antique concept of afterlife into the Christian beliefs for the last judgment and the resurrection of the dead. Among all these finds are included the ones of interest for today's talk. They are exhibited just a few meters north of the site of the tomb where they were found. The burial was placed in a simple pit tomb, one among the thousands of tombs that have been excavated in the eastern necropolis of Thessaloniki. A little girl was deposited in it for her eternal sleep. The small tomb, which barely reached 1 meter in length, was covered with stone slabs. Despite that, the burial was in poor condition, with a skull at the northwestern side of the tomb. In the grave was found a large clay ribbed jug, a type known from many burials of the last quarter of the 3rd and the first quarter of the 4th century, which is considered a local product of Thessaloniki. Also, a pair of gold earrings were found, one on either side of the skull. Actually, these were literally earrings, or probably the simplest type of earrings, consisting of a thin wire bent to form a ring, and its ends were spirally wound to secure it. This type of earrings, which have been discovered in several tombs in Thessaloniki, seem to have been permanently placed in the earlobe from a very young age, as shown by this example, and it is possible that they were the basis from which other, more elaborate hanging earrings were suspended. Also, an iron rod in 4 pieces was found in the area of the shins, which remains unidentified. In addition, 1 bronze coin with traces of fabric on it was found in the area of the deceased right shoulder. The coin, an Antoninus minted in 275 in Kizikos by the Emperor Aurelian, provides the terminus post rem of the burial. 2 pendants found in the area of the dead young girl's chest render this otherwise simple burial very important. The first is wooden, made of black, hard, and glossy wood, possibly ebony. It depicts a flat-headed human figure with African features, crowned with a vertical pointed band diadem, decorated with oblique parallel glyphs, at the top of which is the suspension hole of the pendant. The stylized figure is rendered with curved eyebrows and deeply split eyes, a sharp, spiky nose and jowl, which is flanked by 2 vertical grooves, which probably render a beard. The forehead is marked by 2 wrinkles, while the mouth is not clearly presented. I think it is obvious that this is a work of African style, completely outside the Greco-Roman tradition, even in its most unassumed folk forms. The second pendant is made of amber and forms the protomy of a feline, probably a lion, with 2 intersecting holes, one cut longitudinally and one vertically, making possible its suspension either as a pendant or as a bead. The mane is visible on the better preserved side, making the identification of the animal quite safe. Although amber does not appear in Africa, its use is known, relatively widespread in ancient Egypt. Each of the pendants is unique, at least for the archaeology of the region of Macedonia. We're all well aware of the wide array of effigies and symbols of deities, demons, and other power insignia that have been used in late antique amulets. Also, it's needless to say that the lion is well represented in East Mediterranean ever since the Bronze Age, and in Macedonia in particular from the classical Greek times. This particular form, though, and its use in tandem with the ebony African male figure of what I assume was a demon, are unparalleled in northern Greece. For that matter, I have not been able to locate parallels from other regions either, and I would be grateful if someone from the audience knows more about them. Anyway, I believe that this is one of these rare cases where the sub-Saharan African or Nubian cultural and even possibly racial identity of a Thessalonian was archaeologically revealed. Now, leaving behind us late antiquity and the East, we can turn to the north and move on to the Middle Ages. After the Slavic invasions of the 6th and 7th centuries and the 7th century Arab conquests of the southeastern Mediterranean, Thessaloniki showed a marked demographic growth as people from the northern and central Balkans and frightened inhabitants of the islands in the Aegean coast sought refuge in the city. The city became the administrative center of the empire in the Balkans and a commercial hub for regional and interregional trade. The sack of Thessaloniki by the Saracens in the summer of 904 and the consequent enslavement of its inhabitants resulted in a period of population decline that lasted until the reign of Basil II in the second half of the 10th and the first quarter of the 11th century. From the middle of the 11th century, its economy appeared to be flourishing, according to the anonymous author of the 12th century satirical dialogue Timarion and his description of the annual fair of St. Demetrius. The demographic increase of Thessaloniki and its region continued until the mid-14th century. It has been estimated that the size of the city in the 11th or 12th centuries reached 150,000 inhabitants. The city was briefly captured by the Normans in 1185. Later, at 1204, became the capital of the Latin Crusader state, the Kingdom of Thessalonica, for the next 20 years. In 1224, the capital of the Despotate of Epirus, and finally in 1246, it became part of the Empire of Nicaea, ruled by the Lascarids. Around the city, a series of smaller settlements and castles existed. Of interest for today's presentation is the castle of Rentina, built on Egnatia Road. The castle is built on the highest parts of a naturally fortified hill south of the Richios River at the entrance of Rentina Gorge, at a point crucial for controlling the Egnatia Road and accompanying cargo transit. The first phase of the fortification dates to the 4th century, and it is also possibly identified with the Justinianic Artemision Castle. The area shows signs of continuous human habitation until the 16th century, and its period of prosperity was in the 10th century. Excavations have revealed churches and graveyards dating from as far back as the early Christian period, but mostly from the first half of the 10th century and the Paleologan era. Among the several thousands of the small finds from the decades-long systematic excavation of Rentina's castle, one special glass bead was yielded, a bead attributed to the Slavs, which we will examine here. Here we should also add that in northern Greece, Slavic presence, although noted clearly in historical sources, has only very scarcely been attested through few clay sherds actually, and no Slavic cemeteries or settlements were identified. Our bead is a large eye bead made of translucent dark blue and opaque white glass. The barrel-shaped dark blue body is decorated with 12 relief white and blue eyes arranged in 3 rows. The string hole bears a layer of copper oxidation, indicating the nature of the hanging system of the bead. These eye beads of the type that we are presenting here are generally dated between the 7th and the first half of the 9th century. And namely, examples have been unearthed in Volga region, in northwestern Germany, and in a few sites in Greece, including Thebes, Arcadia, Corinth, and Elis. The adornment with numerous brightly colored beads is a typical feature of the tombs of Slavs and other barbarians, which obviously reflects the female costume, but also their beliefs about the protective or apotropaic power of these colorful objects that adorn not only their neck, but as the case of Sarmatians proves, their entire costume or their high boots as well. In this case, we can assume that the woman's necklace was cut and the precious bead was lost remaining in the castle soil for 12 centuries, providing indirect evidence of the Slavic presence in the area during that period. We can trace yet another person of interest through archaeological remains, a Thessalonian of a different linguistic origin. We trace him in an unconventional way and in a totally unusual, at least for him, location, namely in the upper galleries of the city's cathedral, the Agia Sophia. The church was built in the 7th century as a cross-domed basilica and underwent several phases of reconstructions and repairs, including the addition of an upper floor atop of the narthex in the 11th century. It is covered with splendid mosaics of several periods and a few important wall paintings, which I will leave aside today, in order to focus on an architectural peculiarity known in other Byzantine buildings as well. The areas above the vaults of the north, south, and later west parts were filled with pottery vessels, minimizing thus the weight of the load needed to level up the area, and thus allowing the paving of the floors to form an ambulatory on the upper gallery. The fine-walled amphora-shaped vessels used to fill in the vaults of the northern nave that you see in the center of the slide being presented in the permanent exhibition of the Museum of Byzantine Culture, placed as they were once standing in Sophia. They all date from the 2nd century, and all these hundreds of identical intact vessels appear to be previously unused, and they were regularly placed upside down, as you can see in the photo of them they were found on site. Later on, in the 11th century, in the late 11th century, according to evidence from lead seals and coins, an extra floor was added over the western nave. And this is where the interesting part for today's talk arises. The walls were filled with broken fragments of commonware pottery vessels, all thrown in and piled on top of each other in no specific order. Many of these pots were already broken when used in the building, and they were laid loosely mixed with sherds and soil. Even the better preserved ones had no bottom, probably to facilitate the better draining of the moisture formed in their bodies. In addition to larger vessels like pithoi, amphorae, jars, pitchers, cooking pots, and water jars with incised decoration of rows of animals and floral motifs have been reassembled from this context. Among the amphorae in the western nave, two types have been identified. The first is stocky, you see it on your left-hand side, with a low neck and small overhanging handles. Amphorae of this type have been found as a filling material for walls in palatial buildings in the Mangana in Constantinople, as well as in Hagia Sophia in Ohrid. They often carry stamps on their shoulders relating to content. The second type has a pear-shaped body and raised handles. Amphorae of this type have also been found to fill the vaults of buildings in the Mangana of Constantinople. Furthermore, one of the amphoras bears a painted inscription on the upper part of the body. On the neck of the jar, there is a capital letter E, probably referring to the capacity of the vessel or to the order in which it was loaded or stored. Lower in 2 rows can be read a painted inscription, Inos Pandel, Anemasio, wine of Panteleimon, Anemas Ioannis. The first part refers to the origin of the wine, and the second to the merchant or the owner of the vessel or the final recipient of the content. The location of the site Panteleimonos remains elusive. The aristocratic Anemas family, though, is known in Byzantine sources from the early 9th century until the 15th century. Particularly, Pankratios Anemas is known to possess Epronia, a suburb and its inhabitants nearby Thessaloniki at 1162. It remains unclear if and how was the amphora connected to Anemas family, and which branch of them was connected to the wine production, probably in the area of Thessaloniki in the late 11th century. But nevertheless, this is one of the rare cases in which everyday life, mundane objects get related to historical figures, become individually examined and presented items, given more than a few words in the bibliography and appearing even in exhibition catalogs and other textbooks. To that, known to the public for 35 years vessel, I would like to add today a new entry to all these important finds from Agia Sophia's wall. It is a relatively unassuming water jar with high cylindrical neck, upright, slightly inverted rim, globular body, tapering towards the bottom. Two opposing angular strap handles stretch from the shoulders to the mid-height neck. Neck and upper body are decorated with incised lines, wavy bands, and indentations. On the shoulder of the vessel, a graffito inscription was hiding in plain sight for decades since it was recovered in the 1980s. We read a simple word in Hebrew letters, baraka, and it is clearly written in a very easy to read manner in capital letters of the square type, unfortunately a very conservative form, not offering a date of the inscription on paleographical grounds. The fact that it is secondarily incised makes it quite probable that it occurred in Thessaloniki, where the vessel was used probably for some time before breaking down and becoming part of the architectural feel of city's cathedral. In Judaism, a baraka, nevlogia in Greek, is a formula of benediction or blessing or thanksgiving recited in public or private, usually before the performance of a commandment or an enjoyment of food or fragrance, or on various occasions praising God or expressing gratitude. The function of baraka is to acknowledge God as the source of all blessing. Barakot typically start with the words Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, Lord, our God. The blessed are you prayer is found in the typical blessing of the wine made for Sabbath in every Jewish home. In general, it is the kind of blessing one would expect to find inscribed on a water jar used by a pious Jewish family, quite probably on an everyday basis. The same term in Arab, baraka, appears among the others rendered in Kufic script on the bottom of a 10th century luster-painted clay bowl from Basra, Iraq, now kept in the Jerusalem Museum of Islamic Art. There are more similar vessels of this form in this grouping, but this is the only one bearing an inscription. The other vessels do have incised wavy lines and dots, but no lettering. They could be a local product, but we have no petrographic analysis yet. But they do appear to be almost courseware, not so often imported. As I have already mentioned, the inscription was not incised on fresh clay, unlike the decoration of the vessel. It was incised at a later date, probably by the final owner of the vessel. So even if it was made elsewhere, the inscription could have been added in Thessaloniki, where the vessel was used and eventually discarded. This form of water jar, an object needed by every household in the city, was bought and used by a Jewish family that met their needs with a vessel made or brought to Thessaloniki's thriving market and adorn it with a single word, giving it a special character, transforming it to a constant reminder of their omnipresent God and his blessings. What is generally known of Jews in Thessaloniki can be summarized in the following sentences. They have been living continuously since the Hellenistic and Roman era, later on known as Romagnotes, being the oldest minority group in the city. In the early 1160s, the Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela, who visited Thessaloniki, estimated that in the city were living 500 Jews, among them silk workers. It is implied by Benjamin that some kind of residential segregation was imposed upon the Jews. Yet Archbishop Anastassios of Thessaloniki between 1185 and 1191 complained that during the time of his immediate predecessors, the Jews have been permitted to spread throughout the city. It has been suggested by the scholar David Jacobi that the imperial policy of Jewish residential segregation in Thessaloniki was renewed in the early Paleologan period, and there is a document of 1420 referring to the old, destroyed by fire Jewish neighborhood, placed at the very center of the city. The entire Jewish population of Thessaloniki, possibly diminished down to, at the time, to 50 households, was deported to Constantinople or Constantinople by the Ottoman authorities around 1455, and no Jews were to be found in Thessaloniki in the following decades, as illustrated by Ottoman population censuses carried out from 1478 to 1490. The Sephardic and Ashkenazim Jews settling in the city from around 1490 onward established themselves to the south of the Leoforos, and they remained a very important component of the city until the Holocaust in the middle of the 20th century. All information on Thessalonian Jews in Byzantine times is based on historical sources. Archaeologically, their presence in the city is actually invisible. The jug that we see today is one of the very few, if not the only, material culture remain that can be ascribed to them without any doubt, and brings us closer to this particular group of Thessalonians. Finally, the last group of people among the diversified Byzantine population, or rather a foreign technological influence assumed by the Byzantines that we will present today, are the archers with reflex bows. The medium that will allow us to approach them is the ring they used to protect the flesh of their thumb when they were stretching the string before finally releasing it. These implements, exclusively for male use, appear in the Balkans after the late 13th and in the 14th century. They have a banded hook with a triangular oblique projection for bezel. It is known that simple examples of this utilitarian artifact, just like in modern-day archery, were made of perishable organic materials, such as leather or bone, and thus they are rarely found in excavations. The famous Arabic manuscript, Arab Archery, written around 1500s, records that they were often made of the skin, predominantly of horses and goats, as well as of silver, copper, iron, bone, and horn. Leather ones being superior to metal ones because they are soft and flexible and interfere least with the accuracy of the shooting. Now I will use objects from the Museum of Byzantine Culture, which cover the typology generally known in the Balkans and Anatolia. The first example is bronze, probably gilded, and the bezel is decorated with an engraved 8-petal rosette. Simple, unadorned bone examples found in excavations in Thessaloniki and Rentina, as well as another with inlaid bronze decoration, are all dated to the late Byzantine times. Similar rings are found among the others in many sites in the north of the Balkans in layers of the 14th and 15th century, indicating that they were routinely used in the Balkans. Examples from the Russian Federation of the 14th century are also known. And finally, in Greece, characteristic examples have been unearthed in Aegean, Rhodes, and in the excavations of the American School of Classical Studies in ancient Corinth, also dating back to the Byzantine times. The reflex bow appeared in Byzantium as the standard archery weapon in the 11th century as a result of the multi-ethnic composition of the Byzantine army. Among foreign soldiers, the Seljuk, Pechenegs, and Cuman horse archers are the ones associated with the use of the reflex bow. Due to the higher tension of the bow made of layers of horn, wood, and sinew, shooting was much easier for the riders as it required stretching their arm to the chest and not to the shoulder, as was the case with the Roman bow. The much longer range of the reflex bow and the shorter time required for each shot made the Asian cavalry a formidable opponent from the time of the Scythians through the Huns, the Avars, the Cumans, the Mongols, and finally the Ottoman Turks. The Romans probably encountered this reflex bow through the contact with the Sarmatians and Alans around the Black Sea region. The archer's ring was conceived and invented in tandem with this type of bow, most probably in Central Asia during the 2nd or 3rd century. Archers' rings were used rarely until the 11th century in Byzantium. As common attribute, the reflex bow became current in the representation of holy warriors in the Paleologan period. It is known that some Eastern peoples also used symbol band rings symmetrical in shape to protect the fingers of archers. Chinese jade examples are known, which were introduced and spread in the Islamic world, but for the time being, they have not been encountered in Byzantine realm. The type of asymmetric ring, like our examples, is the only one encountered in Byzantium, and it is easily recognizable. The upper part of the ring is inclined, forming a curved triangular bezel extending beyond the one side of the ring's vertical axis. The rings of the Museum of Byzantine Culture shed light on an evolutionary process that begins with the Turkoman archers of the steppes in northern China and ends with the Balkan warriors of the late Byzantine era and the high-ranking officials of Caliphate and the Ottomans in the Iron Gate. Their evolution reveals how functionality and meeting practical needs shaped an object, which following the social rise of its user exceeding the limits of the tool and was transformed into a jewel, losing in the end all functionality in exactly the same way its owners lost their worst strength and stamina. And with this Eurasian story, I conclude the tour on documenting diverse populations in Thessaloniki and its hinterland, and our attempt to shed light on people who have made themselves visible in the archaeological context by leaving a movable object particular to their religious beliefs, language, ethnic group, and military equipment. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Tasso, for that wonderful lecture. It's so heartening to see so many of you from literally every corner of the earth. We have people from all over the United States, from Greece, from the United Kingdom, but we've also got people joining us from the Bay of Naples in Italy, from Nicosia on Cyprus, and from Istanbul. So welcome to you all. And it's wonderful to see the diversity of the audience. And this, I think, very nicely segs well with Tasso's talk about the diversity of Thessaloniki. If you have any questions for Dr. Antonaras, please use either the chat function on your Zoom or raise your virtual hand, and you can state your question to him directly. So do we have any questions? While we're waiting, Tasso, I had a question. I was actually very interested with the archer's rings, and in classical and prehistoric antiquity, all over Western and Central Europe, but also in Greece, we have another thing which is made out of usually organic material, which is the archer's wrist guard, which is so for the recoil, as it were, of the bow. Do we have any of those in whatever materials in the Byzantine world or later?
Well, they're not represented, at least, on the holy warriors. I mean, who have pretty detailed armory. I mean, their armory is pretty detailed. We assume that they were used as they're used in modern days, but as you said, the only thing that one might ever find of them would be probably a rivet or a metal rivet or some kind of small rings that were probably connecting these different pieces. It's perishable, and our Russian, I mean, people excavating in bogs and in other climates that would have had this kind of material among the finds from the excavations do not record anything of the kind. So no.
Okay. We have a question from Paige Barnett. What do these finds indicate about the social status of these people? Were they traveling through, or were they more local inhabitants, being in the city permanently or semi-permanently? And what does this indicate regarding shifting populations?
I guess the question goes for all four of them, right? Or just the actors? I will assume it's for all four of them. My idea is that they were Thessalonians, whatever that might means. I mean, Los Angelitos. I mean, it was a big city of the time. Apparently, people were coming and leaving. But I think that these were locals, or they became locals, and especially the burial has every indication that it was socially this person belonged to a group of people. It's not an isolated group, and an isolated tomb. We know that they were buried in groups, not ethnically, but somehow they were clusters of tombs belonging to people that had something common in professional or economical or other ways. The Jews, there's no doubt that they were as Thessalonians as anyone else. They are Thessalonians, they were Thessalonians. And as to the archers, I even tend to believe that they were better off I mean, as warriors, they had a better position in this society of this late Byzantine era, where warrior meant a lot and was very much needed. And plus, let's keep in mind that they also were mounted. They had a horse, so it was not infantry. It was not an ordinary soldier, but somebody quite special, having a horse and being equivalent of a knight, let's say. So all this, I think, shed light to the diversity of Thessaloniki's society throughout these 11th, 12th centuries, which more or less was the same in every major Eastern Mediterranean city and port.
Okay, we have a question, Denny, and this is actually from Professor Gerstel herself. Did any of the finds from the metro excavation indicate the diversity of the city?
Well, from what I know from the published finds, there is at least one Goth warrior, a Goth warrior, or at least a burial belonging to what they believe they have identified as a Goth in the Eastern Cemetery, and a basilica very near, actually almost on the wall, city walls. And he was buried with his armory, and this armory is Western, and at that time we had Goths. So this is another indication of another with capital O in Thessaloniki.
One other question that I had was the diversity of the cemeteries, and you know, with this particular young woman, for example, was she placed together with burials that were from people who were foreigners, or people that were slaves, or people from a particular class, or can we tell the populations of the cemeteries? So were different people buried in different ways in different cemeteries?
This is what we assume, but all in all, we have tens of thousands of graves, which are more or less, I mean, they are not identical, but they are very similar, both in the shape as well as in their content. There is no, in this particular part of the cemetery, both male and female, mostly adults, were buried. The majority had a coin, at least a coin, and all of them had at least one or two clay vessels, remains of the burial, they have been doing. I don't know if they were Christians, so I'm avoiding to use descriptive terms of the celebrations or the festivities that were taking place. Anyway, what was happening when they were placed, when they were interred, required the use of one or two different substances kept in clay vessels. So ordinary people, better than ordinary. The ordinary is invisible, I think, archaeologically. We should keep that in mind, that they didn't possess anything, so they are invisible. I would like to pose a question now that everybody is still listening. For more than 15 years, I have been looking for a proper parallel for this African bead. To that end, I think I have discussed, I have pestered, I have bugged curators of African art in major museums, both in Western Europe as well as in Northern America. Nobody really, I think I realized, and nobody had anything to add. I realized that we don't have anything which predates the colonial period from the antiquities of African peoples. Do you know anything that would be before the 17th, 18th century that is indicative of their religion or of other things than, let's say, shackles for slaves, something that was originally from their society and it was brought to the Mediterranean?
There's a comment from Alexandra Ricci. Ευχαριστώ Tasso for this eye-opening presentation. The African piece is very impressive and touching at the same time. It is amazing to see it as part of a Thessaloniki archaeological context. I do see a raised hand from Professor Sarah Morris. If you can unmute yourself, Sarah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi,
Yes, hello. Yes, thank you for a wonderful, very rich talk. So many interesting new corners of a part of the world that many of us think we know something about. I was curious about the glass bead because it actually looks very much like the Phoenician glass beads of the first millennium BC. You showed it in comparison with the other examples that are Slavic and medieval, and some of them look quite different. The ones not so much from Thebes, but the one from Corinth and things like that. So is it possible that it's a long held over tradition of making those almost tri-cornered Phoenician glass beads? I would never have guessed or suspected the Slavic connection, which is of course fascinating. So thank you for enlightening us about that.
Yeah, it took me a few years to realize that it was not Phoenician. I kept it myself for several years, recorded I recorded in the museum as an intrusion because there are no earlier than the 4th AD century layers on the top of the hill. So I thought, okay, probably something before the foundation and all that. But then in Russia, I had the chance to see dozens of these beads, and they are really sloppier and smaller than the Phoenician ones. But I also later on had the chance to study, to touch and fiddle. So yes, I think they are typical for the Slavic milieu, and they are different, smaller, and less well executed than the Phoenician ones.
Thank you. And thank you for everything I learned today. A wonderful presentation.
Also, we have a question from Andrea Besto that speaks to your question, which is, what about the best god figurines as protectors of children? And they're found in burials in places like ancient Santorini and also in Astypalia, in that big infant burial.
Now we're talking about the lion figurine, or
no, we're talking about these are in antiquity, and they actually begin quite early, and they continue into the Hellenistic and Roman periods. But they're little figures of Bes, the Egyptian god Bes, and they're oftentimes found as amulets in burials, particularly of young children, but also of adults. And Professor Paul Skoton also adds to that direct evidence, no, but I am sure you are aware of the depiction of Ethiopians on Exekias's amphora fragment in the Penn Museum. And in fact, I was going to raise that query because we do, in fact, have, and I happen to be teaching this quarter an upper division course on ancient Greek vase painting. And there is, of course, the squires of, or a squire of
in Egypt.
Yes, and there are squires associated with Ethiopians or Libyans, and one of them, in fact, in Black Figure, is actually named Amasis, which is also the name of another Black Figure Greek vase painter, who signs his vases with his name Amasis, which is demonstrably Egyptian. So we wonder if the Amasis painter was in fact African.
That would be something. Okay, thank you for the question. I forgot, or I omitted to present the part. I mean, Bess is ugly per se. I mean, it's supposed to be monstrous and looking fearsome and all that. This guy, this little guy in the ebony, although he's ugly to my Greco-Roman eyes, it's full of power. It's not grotesque. It's not. It is a demon in the ancient Greek, as the ancient Greeks would perceive it. It's a protector. It's somebody. It's a deity, an entity that had a lot of power. That's how I perceive it, and that's what first struck me when I was trying to understand it. Okay, the feline protomy, it is what it is. It's amber, it's not so well preserved, but even at its best, it would have been something of importance. But this ebony figure is really something that the person who carved it believed in it, or had placed a lot of care to make it look as it is. And I don't mean only craftsmanship. So I don't know if it can be connected with Bess. It is apotropaic. It is a protector of some kind. And probably somebody wiser than me will figure it out at some point. I only wish to be around to hear the solution.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tasso. If I were you, I would ask my former colleague at UCLA, Professor Stephen Nelson, who's now the director of CASVA in Washington, D.C., who was our African art specialist. And I'm sure that even if he didn't have an answer for you, he would find who would. So I'll get you in touch with Stephen.
I will. Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I'd like for us collectively to thank Dr. Antonaras for a wonderful lecture and for sharing this with us. So a big round of applause for Tasso. Thank you very much, Tasso.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.